Welcome to Martial Art for the Mind, brought to you by Remote Viewing Instructional Services Incorporated.
Hi, I'm Dr. Paul H. Smith, Major U.S. Army retired, and I'm here to tell you about a fascinating human ability and skill that was developed for the U.S. military, but which is now available to the entire civilian world. This skill is called remote viewing. On November 30th, 1995, Ted Koppel had a surprise for the American people. On Nightline, his late-night television show, he revealed that the U.S. government had just closed down a secret military unit made up of psychic spies. The CIA called this unit the Stargate program. To their surprise, American taxpayers learned that for 23 years the military services had been training soldiers, such as myself, along with selected Department of Defense employees, to use a kind of extrasensory perception to help fight the Cold War. They called this form of ESP remote viewing. Once trained, we remote viewers spied out locations and events around the world. Among our most frequent targets were the Soviet Union, China, and countries in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Using the mind-centered techniques we had been taught, we military remote viewers were able to collect information unavailable in any other way. So, you may ask, what is remote viewing? Remote viewing is a teachable skill. Using it, a remote viewer can obtain mental impressions and information from a distant or hidden location, person, or event not otherwise available in any other way. Neither distance, nor protective shielding, nor even time, can block experienced remote viewers from accessing their targets. Maybe you've heard the word clairvoyance before. Clairvoyance is a French word meaning clear seeing. It refers to a kind of ESP that allows a person to perceive distant people or places. You can think of remote viewing as a sort of disciplined clairvoyance. Using remote viewing, a viewer can direct his or her consciousness across both space and time. One reason I call it disciplined is because, like a martial art, a viewer must master certain techniques to succeed. In the case of remote viewing, many of these techniques are designed to help control what is called mental noise. Mental noise is the mix of memories, suggestions, guesses, and imagination generated by the waking mind. This noise is what has always made psychic perception difficult and often unpredictable. It obscures or distorts real ESP signals as they enter a person's awareness. The discovery of what causes mental noise and how to deal with that noise so the real signal can be correctly perceived is one of the breakthroughs of remote viewing. The term remote viewing itself was originally coined by legendary psychic Ingo Swann and adopted by his fellow researchers at SRI International. SRI is a prestigious research center that was started by Stanford University. Ingo Swann and his fellow researchers, such as Dr. Harold E. Puthoff and Mr. Russell Targ, worked under contract to first the Central Intelligence Agency and later the U.S. military to explore remote viewing and develop it as a tool to collect information about potential foreign threats. One early approach to remote viewing was called outbounder or beacon remote viewing. It involved a remote viewer sitting in an isolation room. The viewer then attempted to direct his or her mind to the hidden location of one or more other people called the beacon team. The beacon team had been sent to a site unknown to the viewer. The viewer would try to focus his or her consciousness on the location where the beacon team was, then gather information and impressions about the beacon's surroundings. The viewer would describe these perceptions with words and sketches, which were recorded. After the remote viewing was over, the viewer's perceptions were compared to the actual target site to see if they matched, and they usually did. In later years, the beacon approach was dispensed with. Instead, they used geographic coordinates, that is, latitude and longitude figures, to point the viewer to the desired target. This was called coordinate remote viewing, or CRV, and used a highly structured, disciplined process for perceiving and organizing ESP impressions. In this approach, the viewer remains fully conscious, sitting in a chair at a table, and through a careful process gains access to the psychic signal line, as we call it. The viewer writes down or draws impressions that come into his or her mind, which are later compared to the target. When remote viewing's existence became public, Ingo Swann urged the newly emerged remote viewing community to adopt an earlier meaning of the acronym CRV. He asked that it from then on be called controlled remote viewing. The word controlled was meant to refer to the disciplined nature of the process. There are certain rules that must be followed for something to be considered remote viewing. First, the viewer must be blind to the target. In other words, the viewer should never know before or during the remote viewing session what the target is. Instead, the person in charge of the remote viewing experiment or operation, we call this person the tasker, picks an arbitrary number to designate the target. Sometimes even just the word target can be used to launch the viewer into the session. You may find this surprising and wonder how the viewer then knows what target to go to. The answer to this question is fairly complex and time-consuming, so I won't explain it here. But be assured, it does work. A second rule is that no one directly involved with the remote viewer or the remote viewing process should know anything about the target either until after the remote viewing session is completed. This is called a double-blind condition, and is meant to keep anyone from accidentally or on purpose leaking non-psychic or non-ESP information about the target to the viewer. Other rules involve feedback, viewing environment, and so on that aren't important to go into here. There are three main kinds of remote viewing. The first is what I like to call generic remote viewing, or GRV for short. You could think of GRV as seat of the pants remote viewing. In the early days of aviation, people learned how to fly airplanes simply by climbing in and taking off. If you didn't crash, you learned how to fly. This was called learning by the seat of your pants. The same is true of generic RV. The earliest remote viewers simply sat down and tried to envision the intended target with their minds. Eventually, through trial and error, they learned how to get it right. A second kind of remote viewing is called ERV, for extended remote viewing. In this kind of remote viewing, the viewer lies on a bed or comfortable couch and tries to achieve what is called a hypnagogic state. That is, mind awake but on the verge of sleep and body asleep. Some people think that one can bring the conscious and subconscious minds closer together this way and hopefully reduce the mental noise. The third kind of remote viewing is controlled remote viewing, or CRV. CRV and the various methods that have splintered off from it are probably the most common form of remote viewing practice today, and it's the kind that I myself use and that I teach my students in my classes. When performing a CRV session, the viewer goes through 6 successive stages, each stage building upon the one before. Stage 1 is the start of the process. It begins when the remote viewer is given a coded number that acts as the psychic address to the intended target. The viewer jots down this coordinate and begins immediately to receive the first very general impressions about the target. These early impressions present the basic form and nature of the target. Upon completing stage 1, the viewer moves on to stage 2 and begins reporting sensory information such as colors, textures, sounds, and smells. Obviously, these impressions are not coming through the normal senses, but are perceived directly in the viewer's mind. In the next stage, stage 3, the viewer begins to make sketches and perceives additional impressions about the target. The process continues through stages 4, 5, and 6, each producing more specific and subtle impressions than the one before. These impressions are recorded both verbally and through sketching, so they can be saved for later analysis and evaluation. Contrary to what many think, remote viewing isn't like having a video camera in your head. This is the way Hollywood portrays psychic behavior. Instead, remote viewers start off with getting just basic kind of limited impressions, bits of perception that come in gradually, fleeting glimpses, if you will, of the target, which ultimately come together to form a much more complete picture in the viewer's mind. Carefully following proper remote viewing principles, the viewer adds to this information, sorting it out from the mental noise. Finally, it all comes together to form a concept of the target as a whole. There is much that is Zen-like about remote viewing, and much that, to master fully, requires the diligence of a trained martial artist. But you ask, is remote viewing really effective? Remote viewing was researched and applied for nearly a quarter of a century by the federal government. Since that time, it has been taught and used for nearly 2 more decades in the civilian world. Many of the results from the government program have now been declassified. They reveal how the skill was used during that era and the level of success that they had. There is also a great deal of scientific evidence showing remote viewing success. As a result, the remote viewing track record is very convincing. Here are a few examples of successful remote viewings compared to their intended target. Remember, the viewer was blind to the target, that is, was given no idea what the target might be until after the session was over. And people continue to find new uses for remote viewing, including helping them with their investment decisions and in collecting information useful personally and in business. One of my students even used a form of remote viewing I taught her to win the Texas Pick 3 lottery twice in 2 weeks. By chance, she would be able to do this only once in over 71,000 tries. Remote viewing is as much an art as a science, so remote viewers don't always succeed. But the fact that they do succeed so often is not just amazing, it is a testimony to the unrealized power locked within each of our own minds. Remote viewing has proved its value not just for the military, but also for the many people who have learned and practiced it since it became public in 1995. It is an impressive skill that augments and amplifies a resource inborn in all humans, native psychic ability. Like karate and judo, remote viewing requires persistence, focus, and discipline to master. But anyone of normal intelligence, with enough practice, with enough persistence, learning the right principles, can master the skill and become competent at it. And that's why we call remote viewing a martial art for the mind.